technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is our Friday weekend edition, and we're so grateful that you can join us. A little bit later, as you might imagine, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation. Round the round table, first of all, we have Liberty McArtor. She is a writer, of course, the host of the Know Why podcast, an individual that was on just the other day when we had the Next Generation podcast and the broadcast as well. And so, Liberty, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
And we have Dr. Merrill Matthews, who is a political analyst and public policy writer, and we always have an entire great time, and we'll be talking about some of these political issues today.
And a lot of them to discuss today.
One of the things I think we might just point out is that even though some of you are thinking, well, it's a year before you have elections, really in less than 2 weeks, about 12 days, a little less than that, maybe almost 10 or 11 days, we have some elections here. I might just mention, Dr. Matthews, you'll be hosting that day, and you have Phil Graham the first hour, John Fund the second hour, and those elections in places like New Jersey and Virginia, very important. But there's also the primary season coming up, and that's what we'll be talking about as well.
Primary season coming up, plus a lot of states are redrawing their lines. In North Carolina, just this week, I think, passed legislation to try to move forward on redrawing their lines to try to get one more Republican. And, of course, this is sort of the mid-decade effort to do that, which they haven't typically done. So a lot of things are going on out there. It's not sort of the quiet time that you sometimes get in the middle of a decade.
It really is amazing to me, too, that they are redrawing those lines. We'll talk about that. But let me just give you an overview of over the next few hours. We're going to talk about political fantasies, and that has to do with a Senate candidate in Maine. And our listeners in Maine or the Northeast probably know more about that, but this has become a national story. And I think an illustration of what the Democrats, in this case, from Politico, keep falling for political fantasies. Yeah, we'll be equal grief giver, because there's a couple of times where Republicans have done that as well. Then that sort of leads into one on just this whole area of growing political violence. This comes from the Free Press. And a little bit later, we'll get into some things like why are men leaving the left? Some comments about Pete Hegseth and the military lessons from history from Cal Thomas. And, of course, we had the No Kings rally last weekend, and Victor Davis Hanson, who are the real kings. But this first article, Dr. Matthews, let me come to you, is Democrats keep falling for political fantasies. Mm-hmm. When will they learn? Now, Jonathan Martin, who wrote this, probably is more left of center, I suspect, on his perspective, but he just is rolling his eyes, shaking his head, whatever metaphor you want to use, because for those of you that do not know, one of these Senate candidates, if you can't make this up, apparently has a Nazi tattoo on his body. And he's, of course, a Democratic candidate. And so the Democrats are trying to come up with all sorts of explanations for how this is okay. And again, I just think it is a good illustration that if this was a Republican candidate, he would have stepped down a week ago and we wouldn't even know about it. But here, this is just this ongoing issue, isn't it?
He's a Senate candidate in Maine.
Yes.
And he's had this tattoo, apparently, and he's a former Marine.
Yeah.
But he's had the tattoo, I think, for 10 years or so, he said. But if that were the only thing that was problematic for him, you might be able, because he said, I didn't know anything about this. It's kind of a skull with some crossbones or something that similar to what the Nazis used. But you might be able to get past this. But he's also had a number of tweets out there, a number of things on text messages that just are inappropriate inappropriate and unacceptable, and it is really dragging him down. But the point that the article makes is that Democrats are out there looking for these. Beto O'Rourke. We thought Beto O'Rourke was going to be this great person to save the Democrats, and it didn't. Kamala Harris, well, she was she was a vice president. My goodness, she had been a senator, been a attorney general in California. Maybe she will come out and save us. And they constantly are looking for these candidates out there who just kind of come out, not so much Kamala Harris, but are out there, kind of come out of the blue. They look at them and say, this is going to be the person who's going to bring salvation to us as a party.
Well, again, they've got a long list. Amy McGrath, Stacey Abrams.
Yes, Stacey Abrams.
Our Georgia listeners know that. Beto O'Rourke, there's one in Texas. And, of course, this individual, Graham Plattner. But the bottom line is, Liberty, let me come to you for just a minute, because there is this need right now to find the person with star quality. And after Barack Obama, that hasn't been so successful for the Democrats. So it seems like the next person that just come out, they're willing to sometimes put them in a position where they really are going to embarrass themselves and the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. And I can't help but notice, and this is more of a correlation, but we do know just from, for instance, the Pew Research Center, that voters who regularly attend religious services are more likely to lean Republican, and those who aren't as religious affiliated or active more likely to lean Democrat. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of this desire for a savior and having that complex. And of course, we do see that on the right too as well. But I think that that's even accentuated when you are looking for a sort of cult of personality to rally around. And maybe you don't have any hope outside of politics. But I think they've also seen Trump's popularity, which is definitely centered largely around his personality for a lot of MAGA voters, and they're wanting to replicate that.
Again, Jonathan Martin has written this, and I really encourage you to read it because it goes on for some time, and we maybe won't spend a lot of time on it, but he says, I recognize that the party is forever looking for the next JFK or the next Barack Obama, but I'm not sure Zohran Mamdani or Stacey Abrams or Beto O'Rourke or Amy McGrath or, in this case, Graham Plattner or a variety of others are actually the next individual there, and they're people seriously. Dr. Matthews talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez not just running for the Senate, but running for the presidency.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think the way to phrase this is the Democrats look for this fresh face that hasn't been really tried on a national scale yet. So Bill Clinton was something of a fresh face for them.
That's true.
That was here comes the governor of Arkansas.
Yeah.
And Barack Obama, as you mentioned, he comes in. He's a brand new senator from Illinois, and is able to. He looks like this fresh face that we haven't seen before, and they tend to gravitate those. And they do it time and time again, though they didn't do it with Joe Biden. Let's just say that wasn't one of them.
Just as we go to a break, let's just mention that for our younger listeners out there, there was a time when the candidates were chosen in smoke-filled rooms. And even with John F. Kennedy, there were only a few primaries, and it was after he won a few primaries that then the party regulars said, okay, maybe he could win. So there was sort of a senior system. There was also an understanding that these people had to be vetted. But once you had, after George McGovern, the idea of all these primaries and all the rest of these kinds of things, you've had this circumstance where the fresh new face gets put out there long before he or she is ready.
And that's why he quotes from the person who said, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line.
Anyway, let's take a break. It is a very good piece, and we'll come back and we'll try to mention a few Republicans, but this long list was just really striking. Stacey Abrams, Beto O'Rourke, and of course, if you haven't heard of Graham Plattner, well, he's in the news these days, even if you don't live in the state of Maine. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Emily Peck reports that Americans don't think college is worth it. She provides economic facts to show that it still is worth it. She may have trouble convincing many parents and even students. The share of Americans who say college is very important dropped significantly over the past decade. The most significant drop was among Republicans. In 2013, 68% said that a college education was very important. This year, it dropped to 20%. Even among Democrats, the percentages dropped by half. You might have predicted some of the drop for Republicans because of the criticism that colleges are indoctrinating students in woke ideas, but the drop among Democrats illustrates that there are other reasons for the declining value of college. Cost is one reason. A college education is very expensive, student debt is high, and graduates wonder if they'll ever make enough money to pay back student loans. In the background is also the fear that AI will shrink the job market for a college graduate. Other opportunities are another reason. There is growing interest on the part of young adults to work in skilled trades. These can be successful careers and would probably be less threatened by AI than white-collar jobs. Emily Peck argues that a college degree is important and points to the fact that college graduates earn twice what high school graduates make. Of course, it is still possible to become financially successful without a college degree, and I suspect that lumped into that median high school degree income are many who never developed meaningful skills and are less employable. Americans are not as convinced as they used to be that college is worth it. Parents and their children need to evaluate what is best for them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor with us. And again, this first article that comes out of Politico, of all things, Jonathan Martin, Democrats keep falling for political fantasies. When will they learn? And Dr. Matthews, you mentioned the idea that oftentimes Democrats are seen as falling in love, Republicans falling in line. Mm-hmm. And there have been some candidates that probably did not energize the conservative base of the Republican Party, but everybody learned to fall in line, didn't they?
Right, and that would be George Herbert Walker Bush in 1988, and then 1992. He lost that second one. Then you had Bob Dole in 1996. I was not thrilled at all about him, but he was going to be the candidate. In 2000, you had George W. Bush, who was a little better than some of the others, but still most people weren't that wild about him. 2008, you had John McCain. No, I can't think of anybody who was really wild about him, but you had to fall in line. And then you had Mitt Romney in 2012.
That's right. And so, when you talk about a fresh face, one that comes to mind is Dan Quayle, who was a senator out of Indiana. But you and I were talking over the break. The freshest face is
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
That's 2016.
Nobody, you have to go back 10 years, thought that this candidacy had any chance, and here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. So again, I don't know, Liberty, do you have any suggestions? Because again, I think in many cases, as Merrill Matthews just pointed out, Democrats tend to fall in love, and it's just whoever has just come down the pike, Graham Plattner or Stacey Abrams, Amy McGrath, Beto O'Rourke. I mean, the list gets pretty long after a while. Anybody you can think of?
Well, I don't know, maybe just a happy medium between somebody with zero vetting and experience, it seems like, versus somebody who has been in politics way too long, like when they did go with Joe Biden, when there were, it seems to me, looking from the outside, several interesting candidates that at least had some experience in the Senate as governors, et cetera. But I kind of wish that maybe more people would fall in line, and our culture has gotten kind of addicted to falling in love. And I think that's dangerous because it is fertile ground for people to be more and more extreme and make their personality, the story rather than just the policies, and somebody that's stable and experienced and can get the job done.
Yeah, Jasmine Crockett is another one that comes to mind right now, and AOC and all those. And let me, because this kind of leads into our other article that comes, interestingly enough, from the Free Press, the candidate in Maine. And the interesting thing is, you would think this would be the end of his candidacy, and it may be, because the Democratic rival is the governor, Janet Mills. But nevertheless, I mean, he's said some pretty interesting things. First of all, he's rationalizing political violence, which we're going to talk about. He calls himself a communist, referred to the police as bastards, calls himself an Antifa super soldier. He's referring to some police officers as overweight pansies. Those are the compliments. I mean,
those are things you can print.
Goodness. And, as in a minute, we're going to talk about this very good piece by the editors of the Free Press, The Growing Political Violence. And I'll use this to hold up the booklet for those of you watching online. Our next booklet, it hasn't been mailed yet, but you'll be seeing it soon, is a biblical view on this issue of political violence. We recognize that is the case. And yet, interestingly enough, the ability, for at least for the moment, for some of the party regulars in Maine, but let's go to Virginia, because I know you'll be talking about that with John Fun and others, that have said some pretty outrageous things, yet the party, because they want that individual to win, even though what they've said is repulsive and very really concerning in terms of some of those ideas, that I think illustrates again how sometimes the Democratic Party puts together these apologists to try to defend the indefensible.
Right. They tend to give people on their side who say outrageous things a pass, but then go after any sort of moderate independent or Republican if they say something even similar or even less offensive. So that's part of what the game is now. But it is interesting. In these days, there's so much out there on social media that if you have any inclination that you may think you want to run for politics or just get a job because somebody who doesn't want you in that job could find these things, you ought to refrain from saying, you shouldn't think these things anyway, but even if you think them, you ought to refrain from trying to make them public.
Liberty, let me come to you because I know you've covered some of that before in your Know Why podcast and in some of the Next Generation Roundtable. The younger generation is not thinking sometimes 20 years from now when they want to get a job or when they want to run for office or they want to be serving on the city council. But the things you post today on social media have a life of their own. And here's a good example of a Senate candidate in the state of Maine who is having all of it come back to bite him.
And I just wonder how he wasn't smart enough to take care of some of that before he decided to run. I mean, Facebook was barely around when I was a teenager, and already my parents and parents of my friends were saying the internet is forever, and they were right. And even more so today, we talked about that on the roundtable just a few days ago, and so it's just so easy for people to dig up dirt. And it's easy for people to dig up past things and twist it. But then when you just put something out there that's on its face just bad, it is going to come back around. So integrity all the time. Integrity is what people need to remember, and maybe a little bit of smart too.
And you know what happens here is that sometimes you see somebody has taken and removed a tweet or something that they had put out there that they found out was offensive, but people take screenshots of these things, and even if you go and remove that, somebody else has got a picture of it. And it goes back to this issue of just because something can be said doesn't mean it should be said.
And again, we've posted some pieces here. I have a way to prevent you from being embarrassed by the things that you've said, and that is don't say them, and certainly don't write them in a format that will guarantee that people will hear that forever. Well, that's a natural lead into one of our other articles, and this comes from the editors of the Free Press, America's Growing Political Violence Problem. The only problem I have with the article is it always tries to make it sound like there's a problem on both sides, but let's leave that to the side for just a minute, because they do give us a long list of individuals who actually are convinced that the way to solve problems in this world today is not to provide alternative views and the antidote to bad language and bad speech is good speech, and more speech is to just simply, we have what many people are calling an assassination culture, and that's one of the reasons we have this booklet on a biblical point of view on political violence.
And, one of the things we've seen growing is the anti-Semitism out there, with attacks on synagogues, attacks on Jews, attacks on Jewish shops, and so forth, that had nothing to do with anything that was going on in Israel. So we've seen that, and even the attacks on ICE. So we typically think of this as an attack on an individual, a politician. But of course, here in Dallas, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a shooter out there shooting ICE agents. We thought he was shooting ICE agents. He ended up hitting the illegal aliens they were transporting. We're seeing an awful lot of this these days.
Well, and again, one of the things I did yesterday, decided at least to make it the last segment because it might have gotten into the deep weeds a little bit, is John, you talked about the justification for using the National Guard in places like Portland and Chicago. And if you look at some of the court cases right now, they've ruled in some cases against Donald Trump. But the evidence is pretty clear that when you have, even if you don't call this an insurrection and simply say an inability to enforce federal law, that's justifiable enough. And you and I are old enough to remember when in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower, and then later in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy had to call out the National Guard just to protect individuals.
And some of these are protecting ICE or the other federal buildings that people have been attacking or putting graffiti on and other things of that nature, where the workers, the federal workers who were going to come in if they weren't laid off right now, but if they were coming in, they didn't feel it was safe to come in because of the mobs that were out in front of the building.
We need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into this a little bit more. Let me open up the phones, too. Maybe you have some thoughts about some of these, what we call political fantasies, or a question about violence. Let me just also indicate that a little bit later we are going to get into some other issues, the attempt by Pete Hegseth and the Secretary of War to really close down press access. We'll talk about, interesting enough, a new Gallup poll that says many people in the country believe government has too much power. We'll get into some other issues as well. So a lot to cover, but nevertheless, if you would like to join the conversation, the number is 1-800-351-1212. I've postponed the whole conversation about sports gambling till Monday, but we're going to be getting into that in some detail. But if you want to bring that up, that is certainly relevant as well. Our take action item is to Prevent Government Shutdowns Act of 2025. Oh, yes, we still have a government shutdown, as Merrill Matthews just reminded us. And we'll come back. And if you want to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor, but we'd love to hear from you if you'd like to join the conversation. Focus just for another few minutes on this particular article on political violence. To their credit, they've only limited it to what we might call political violence, but in our booklet here, we also go into violence on campus, violence in the streets, because that's all the violence against ICE enforcement. Quoting from Heather Heather McDonald and Michael Schellenberger and Ben Sass and a variety of others that I thought might mention. But this article, Liberty, I think just reminds us that this is more than just going after just people in the political realm. Yes, there was, of course, an individual who threatened to kill House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. But in the same article, it points out the fact that they learned and have arrested an individual that wanted to kill Seth Dillon. Well, you're talking about an individual of Babylon Bee fame, Josh Hammer. Then you talk about a man who's arrested making handmade destructive devices outside St. Mary's Cathedral because he wanted to kill Supreme Court justices. And, of course, we've mentioned, the death of Charlie Kirk, but one of the individuals that used to work with him, individual wanted to kill Benny Johnson, who's another one of these podcasters. And that's in addition to the fact that we have, of course, some of the outrageous things that have been said so far by an individual that his name is Graham Plattner in Maine, or let's not forget Jay Jones, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in the state of Virginia. So, Liberty, this is bigger and broader than just even what we might normally consider to be political violence.
It is, and it's sad because what we're seeing is an increase in acceptance of combating speech or ideas that you don't like with violence. And I think, even just Barry Weiss, founder of the Free Press, I saw a news article yesterday where she was in New York with 6 bodyguards because she's been threatened. And that's, the editorial group who actually wrote this article. So it's really sad. And, one thing that I think they did a good job of highlighting was that it's becoming more normalized.
Right.
And
that's the issue.
I want to just highlight the role that I think the internet and social media plays in that, especially for people with, young adults or kids who are online a lot, spending hours and hours. What a lot of parents don't realize is that social media algorithms, like on Instagram, they serve up violent videos. They know if you are a young man, a young boy. And so it is common for 12-year-old boys to see videos of beheadings from around the world that they did not search for, but they just happened to come across on Instagram suggested content for them. And then, even in just the last couple of months, we had the horrible, murder of the young lady on the train, obviously Charlie Kirk. And these were things where you open social media, and for a lot of people, including me, all of a sudden I'm seeing this. And I didn't look for it or ask for it. And I think that as sad and dark as that is, we have a generation that's actually been raised seeing that. And I don't think that helps. So I think that's just an element to be aware of, too, with how this is being normalized.
And Liberty pointed out that it's becoming normalized, and I would add that we're almost becoming anesthetized.
That's very true.
So that if I'm looking at the local news and it leads with somebody who's only one person or 2 people killed, it's kind of like, oh, is that really a story? If it's not 5 or 6 people, it's you just get used to so many of them. It's not as shocking anymore.
And again, I quoted from Heather McDonald, who was, of course, quoting from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Defining Deviancy Down, and that is certainly the case. So this one ends by saying there's no outside force that will fix the division that ails this country. We have to do it ourselves. And as much as I appreciate the sentiment, I think, Liberty, you and I are contributing to an article and a series of articles that will come out in Outlook in December on the need for revival, maybe even the evidence for revival, because I do actually disagree. I think outside force, the gospel, and certainly God's judgment on this country and maybe a revival are going to be some very significant things that may indeed have to take place before this becomes anywhere, maybe a footnote in history. And right now, as we said, it's becoming entirely too normalized, isn't it?
Yeah, what we're seeing is what happens when there is no outside force, when it is just us left to try to figure this out. Human beings kill each other and are horrible to each other, and so we need God. And again, we are seeing this ideology of, okay, I see something I perceive as being hateful or offensive or bad, and I react by violence. So the very premise that you can even have any sort of peaceful dialogue about ideas you disagree with, or turn the other cheek or anything like that. People have just lost that sensibility. So absolutely, we need revival. We need it bad.
You know, one of the things it's often said that the video games and things like that sort of exacerbate this. I don't know whether it's true or not. You can see a lot of violence on television and video games. When you and I were young, Kerby, we carried around toy guns and we were shooting at each other and bang bang and stuff. But we would never carry that over to use it as. I mean, that we played with toy guns, but we didn't. It never crossed our minds that we would actually go and hurt somebody with that. So it's not clear to me whether that happens or not. You can certainly play with guns, and I know people today who will not let their kids have toy guns because they feel like that sort of exacerbates violence. Wasn't with me, but but we'll let them go and use video games, and there's a lot of questions here I don't know we have good answers for.
Well, and one of the examples I used in a program years ago, and probably the one that I got the most criticism of any TV show I've ever done, was when they were talking about violence in the schools, and most of the individuals that were participants were African American, and they were talking about the guns in the schools and having to have all sorts of ways to prevent any school from having guns. And I just pointed out in passing, and I should have not, but that growing up, some of us actually had rifle clubs in the school. There were individuals that would come and put their rifle in the back of the room, and then later they would go to the target and shoot, and sometimes they would go out hunting. And so I said, we used to have guns in the schools. Those guns were loaded. And of course, they just went bananas over that. But the point I'm making is it wasn't the guns, it was the mindset behind the guns. And then, of course, says, well, they didn't have AR-15s and all that kind of stuff. They didn't have 357 Magnums. True. But the point is, if you keep looking at the guns or even at the video violence, part of it is back to this issue of a real need for a spiritual revival, for a need for us to come back, as we talked about even yesterday on the program, to recognize that human beings are created in God's image and everybody has value and dignity. But when most people believe that we're just here as a cosmic accident and it's the survival of the fittest, a Darwinian kind of mindset, it's not surprising that we've had these kind of problems.
Yes, if you think we live in a world where it's survival of the fittest, the person with the biggest gun actually becomes the best able to survive.
Yes. So, Liberty, if nothing else, we certainly recognize that it is important to have parents evaluate what their children are watching on their smartphones and on television and the rest. But I think ultimately we recognize, as important as it is to limit media exposure, and certainly that is significant. I also think some of these harsh comments being made that justify violence, you're a fascist, you're a Nazi, whatever it might be, those are all issues that are going to have to be addressed, and ultimately makes me want to have a spiritual renewal and revival take place starting right this afternoon. What are your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. That is the answer. It is a disease, and we are seeing the symptoms of it.
Well, let's see, we can take a break, and when we come back, Dr. Matthews, we have one of your articles on the Hill, and you suggest that Pete Hegseth, who is our Secretary of War, still trying to get used to that, as in some respects channeling President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board. And we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I haven't seen many of the people in the press go along with his attempt to try to prevent the leaks that oftentimes come from government and to require, as you said, sort of a Mother May I pledge for talking to people in the military. So we're going to come back, and that is, I think, a very important article. Next hour, we'll get into a couple of other things. Can we learn some lessons from history? Cal Thomas reminds us of a few of those. A recent Gallup poll, I think, illustrates only so well that most Americans are saying, maybe government has gotten too big, and maybe it's trying to get involved too much in our lives. And we'll see what people say after a couple more weeks of a shutdown that doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. And of course, very good piece by Victor Davis Hanson on who are the real kings. You can go to our website right now and find some very good articles. Also, for those of you listening online, you'll hear Penna Dexter's commentary. And we'll be back right after this.
In an article published in the journal First Things, Jonathan Sanford, president of the University of Dallas, described a concept that rings true for me, having just returned from a 3-week trip to Italy. Dr. Sanford writes, "A pilgrim differs from a tourist in that the former seeks meaning, not diversion. Our students, prepared in advance, arrive at historical and religious sites, ready to see them within a larger story, the unfolding of Western civilization and the Christian tradition. They discover that they themselves belong to this story. Though not anywhere near as well prepared as these students, I hoped my trip to ancient cities and sites where Christianity took root, where it blossomed, and where Christians faced persecution, even death for their faith, would change me. My husband and I took a flight a few days ahead of our tour group to spend time in the churches and art museums of Florence. Once our group arrived, the teaching we received helped us understand Roman society and culture during the time of the imprisonment of the Apostle Paul and through the Renaissance. In churches and museums, our hearts were lifted to worship. We learned that illiterate townspeople could read the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ in paintings that adorned the walls of churches. The apostles' stories were similarly chronicled in churches built to honor their lives and deaths. Dr. Sanford, also a philosophy professor, takes students abroad during summer term. In his First Things article, he addresses the superabundance of Western art and architecture and asks, why so many churches adorned with frescoes, mosaics, and sculptures designed to last millennia? Why multi-course Italian meals when one would suffice? These things, he says, are expressions of our deepest longing for the eternal. The structure of ancient cathedrals lifts the eyes, drawing one's attention above. There's a sense of the nearness of Christ. How could I not be changed? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Merrill Matthews and Liberty McArtor with us. And Dr. Matthews, let me come to you because this was in The Hill. And it's interesting because we have talked about the fact that the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, wants to eliminate some of the leaks and wants to make sure that people aren't producing and publishing information that could violate national security. But you point out that it does remind you of something that was instituted under President Joe Biden, the Disinformation Governance Board, which was quickly ridiculed into oblivion. Tell us more.
Yes, this came about in April of 2022, and the Biden administration created this Disinformation Governance Board with the goal, and it was part of the Department of Homeland Security, with the goal of trying to dispel any misinformation or disinformation out there. And it was immediately ridiculed as something similar to George Orwell's Ministry of Truth in the novel 1984, because the Ministry of Truth was about lying and propaganda, not getting truth. And of course, it was he had named a 33-year-old young lady to be the head of this. people looked at it and she says, "Oh my goodness, she's so liberal. She would just be taking the liberal stance on everything." And so it was within 3 weeks she resigned because she had gotten so much pressure, and they just sort of let the thing float until August of that year, and they finally got rid of it. So it really never actually did anything.
Yeah.
What Pete Hegseth has done is he wants the media to sign a pledge. They've come out with several new restrictions. You can't go wandering the halls in the Pentagon unless you have credentials and you've gotten permission to do that. But also you have to be willing to sign a thing saying you will not release any information without getting it approved first by the officials that are doing that. I guess the media people there. And so if you don't do that, you don't get access to the Pentagon or to the press briefings at the Pentagon. And the large majority of the standard media, including Fox News, Newsmax, the Washington Times, have said that's not appropriate. That's a violation of the freedom of the First Amendment, and they're not signing. So last I heard, there was about 30 or 35 organizations that have decided not to do this. A few, according to The Independent, which is a British publication, that a few people, independent journalists and so forth, have gone ahead and signed it. I think Epoch Times has signed it, but most have not. And I think that's where, as far as I know, that's where we are right now. And so the problem with this was, if you're an investigator, you want to go out and you want to find information. Most of the time, you can trust the information coming from the government, military, and so forth. Sometimes you can't. And in some cases, governments do things that they wish people did not know about. And so the notion that you would have to go through the military and have to get either the military spin on it, or if the military decides you can't publish that, then you don't get to do it. Or it could be even that the military, the spokespeople say, yes, you can say this, but say something good about the administration in there. This is just something the media, so far, are not willing to take.
Well, and you talk about the media, or if you will, the administrative missteps, different presidents. You can go to Dwight Eisenhower, and you talk about that one, denying that we had surveillance, and then they shoot down Gary Powers, Francis Gary Powers, and U2. President Kennedy's Bay of Pigs incident. You didn't mention this one. We certainly could talk about Lyndon Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the Pentagon Papers. You mentioned Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal, Jimmy Carter's failed attempt to rescue American hostages, President Reagan's Iran-Contra scandal, and we've only made our way up to the 1980s. So you can see that there is always been a need for the press to have the freedom to pursue some of these stories, and this is an attempt to clamp down, as much as we would appreciate the fact that some of these leaks might have actually exposed individuals to harm and may have really hurt our ability worldwide. I think this is, to use one phrase that you love to use from time to time, a bridge too far.
Yes. For instance, President Eisenhower had specifically told Nikita Khrushchev of Russia that we were not engaged in spying on Russia, and then they shoot down the U-2 spy plane that had Francis Gary Powers, and now they've got it. He was supposed to. Francis Gary Powers was given a cyanide pill. He did not take it. And so they were able to parade him around, and that forced Eisenhower to come up and say, well, I guess I wasn't telling the truth. That's something as a military man, as a president, you just would rather not have to concede.
Yes. Well, Liberty, I'd love to get your thoughts, because we've just given the examples up to the 1980s, but I'm sure you could finish off with all sorts of things we've learned since then. And that's why we certainly do believe in a free press and a First Amendment. Guess we lost her, so we'll come back and get into some other issues in just a minute.
Oh, sorry. I'm back now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we certainly can.
Okay, great. Yeah, there are problems with the mainstream media, and but again, as with speech, if there's media that you think is too biased, then that's a great thing about a free press is you can start your own media organization, as many people have. And so, I understand the motivation to not have leaks, not have unflattering information out there, or what seems like biased information about the administration when they do have a lot of high stakes issues going on. But as somebody with training in journalism, and that's what my undergraduate degree was in, it does definitely make me uncomfortable to try to have reporters sign something that they will get approval or include something positive about the administration before they get to publish something. It reminds me a little too much of other nations where all these papers have to be approved by certain communist governments. And I would just rather not do anything that even looks like we're going down that route in the United States.
And, Kerby, where I was going with this is Trump right now is engaged in blowing up ships.
Yeah, in Venezuela,
in Venezuela,
ships,
and now in the Pacific
ships,
now,
yeah.
which he feels like, which they have intelligence, I guess, saying that there's drug running on this, and these are terrorists or drug runners. So they've blown them up, but they're not stopping the ships and checking to see first. And so the concern is that they may end up, my guess is the intelligence is probably good, but sometimes there are intelligence failures. And my guess is that if something happened and they hit a ship that they thought was running drugs and they found out later that they weren't, they would not want that information out. And that's where a whistleblower might come up and say, let me tell you what was going to what's happened there. But if the media couldn't report this, and sometimes whistleblowers give us good information about things that are happening, then you would stifle that information. And we need to be able to know that.
I think so. So again, I just wanted to post that up there. Sometimes people say, well, do you say anything critical of the Trump administration? I said, have you been listening to the program? We have certainly appreciated so many things that Donald Trump and his administration have pursued. But when it crosses a line, and I think this one crosses a line in terms of First Amendment, we're going to call that out too.
And they're humans. It's always a mixed bag. I mean, presidents want to have typically as much power as they can and sometimes exercise it. And they often don't want that known if they make a mistake. And so that's nothing new about Donald Trump. I mean, that's standard.
How about Barack Obama? Then he actually was pursuing some of the Fox News reporters things like that. So again, this has been happening both Republicans and Democrats, and is understandable because, as we just gave you just the short list of presidents who had some things they didn't want the press to cover, we know about that because of the press. So as much as we sometimes talk about how there is a fair amount of media malpractice these days, there certainly is a need for the press as well. We're going to take a break, and we come back, a lot of other things to cover. We haven't even mentioned My Viewpoints commentary today, Penna Dexter's, which we'll talk about next hour as well, and a couple other very important articles we've posted. So if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to read some of these for myself, they're available at the website pointofview.net. As you go there, of course, you can certainly also get some of the other Viewpoints material, the videos. We have a Take Action item. We even have, of course, the highlights of Point of View on Spotify, all available at pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today. Again, if you'd like to join the conversation or just sit back and take some notes, 1-800-351-1212. Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor, and one of the articles we've posted, Why Men Are Leaving the Left and Not Coming Back. Buddy Matthews, first of all, when I saw that, I said, we've got to have this on here because Liberty will be here, because this is the kind of stuff that I know Liberty talks about in the No Wife podcast. I know that that's even the kind of conversation that took place just the other day in the Next Generation broadcast as well. And so this is, I think, a big issue. And what I thought was so interesting is this also appeared in The Hill. You, of course, write for The Hill. And I thought it was quite intriguing. So if nothing else, Liberty, let's come to you, because the author suggests, and I think it's easy to document, that the Democratic Party is hemorrhaging men, and across the U.S. they are leaving in waves. This is certainly something that the Democratic leadership have noticed. It is something that you have noticed Kamala Harris talking about, and a variety of others. And there was an attempt to try to see if, whether it's Tim Walz or Pete Buttigieg or somebody, could maybe draw some of them back, and that didn't work very well. So what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things in the article that I thought was funny and appropriate is that they're trying to create these events and strategies to draw men back, and it seems like they're being thought up by people who've never met a man before, and they're just the core.
Great line.
The core problem, though, is that for years the left has really made a lot of men feel like there is something inherently wrong with them, and of course, there is something wrong with all human beings. We're all sinful. Nobody's perfect. But even, I remember back when Me Too was a big deal, and there were a lot of legitimate, corruption and abuse and things that needed to be exposed. But it went so far that I remember seeing articles in places like the New York Times where women were writing publicly about having like bitterness towards their sons that were little children, and like being hesitant about even raising boys, because they were so fearful of men. And so men hear that kind of thing. Boys grow up hearing that kind of thing, and they just think, well, there's something wrong with me. And then if you have Trump or Pete Hegseth or other figures on the right, Joe Rogan, podcasters, that say, actually, it's okay to be a man, and you can not just be a man, and you can be masculine. And, of course, you have kind of some problems on the manosphere, of course, which we've talked about, but you have some groups saying that it's good to be a man and there's not anything inherently wrong with you just because you're male. And then you have another group that for years has said the opposite. And now they're trying to rectify that, and it's just not working.
And they've had books come out, The War Against Men, and there were certainly some things that we talked about in the old days when Penedextra was one of the co-hosts, about how the whole feminist ideology was pushing this idea that men have to be more like women. And, of course, the argument that was being made originally by the feminists, Dr. Matthews, was, well, we really need to stand up for women, and yet if you look at all the statistics, more women go to college than men, more women graduate from college than men. more women now have graduate degrees than men.
More women going to healthcare and medical doctors and so forth.
Yeah. So go ahead.
And you know what happened when, and Liberty alluded to this, when the Democrats put Tim Walz as the vice presidential candidate, they wanted to stress that he was a hunter and that he was a coach. And the notion is that if we can show you that this person has done manly things, you will think he's a manly man. And that's not the case. It's you have to come across as what we used to call a manly man. And it's not just because I've done something in the past, but it's because of who I am and what I do, and just the part of us that makes us men. I've got a grandson who's just about to turn 9, and you didn't have to teach him to like dinosaurs, spaceships, diggers. My
tractors.
Tractors. My wife gave him a digger one time for Christmas because he just loves digging with it. You didn't have to teach him that.
Didn't have to teach that.
He wanted to do those things. He's got a sister who's not like that at all. She likes to read and do feminine sorts of things. He's just a little boy, and those just sort of come out. And so the notion that men like to watch sports, I don't do a lot of it, but a lot of men do. People like to go hunting. They like to do a number of things, and they like competition. That's part of the man's psyche. And the notion that you come up and say, well, we can't have anybody win. Everybody's a winner. Well, that doesn't speak to men. I want to see who the winner is. I want to see who the loser is.
Yes. Well, and again, let me tie this back to the first article, because we were talking about this Graham Plattner. I hate to maybe make him our punching bag, but he is today, and that is they liked him because of a Marine and all that. And then we find out that he's got a Nazi tattoo. And so it gets back to this idea that when we see men leaving, then we are going to engage in the political fantasies and try to find the savior that maybe will bring men back to the fold. Is that fair?
It is, and it's interesting because you sometimes see people out there saying, I want a man who's emotional, and I want a man who's this way. Tom Nelson at Denton Bible Church used to point out that when your daughter's dating somebody, you get real Baptist all of a sudden. You want this person to treat her with respect. You want him to be kind, gentle, and so forth. But it doesn't necessarily mean you want him to be a wimp. And so that's it's part of the culture that the left has just tried to push away, trying to, in essence, neuter men, and that's not the way you get society. It's not the way men vote.
One of the things I thought, Liberty, we might talk about, because I recognize there's an age difference, which is why I like to talk about these issues, because if you're younger, you might think, well, that's always the way it was. But in the second page of this very good commentary, the author points out that there wasn't always this disconnect. The Democratic Party once inspired men to see themselves as greater. They talked about families. They talked about unions. I mean, unions have always been part of the Democratic Party, as well as those who were defending. So there was a time when this was not the hemorrhaging of men in the Democratic Party that we see today.
And, during the Vietnam War, Democrats turned against the military and were very, very aggressive in their opposition to the military. Here, just within the past few years, they turned against the police and were very, very aggressive in their opposition to police. And both of those positions is what you think. There are women in the military and police force now also, but they're people where it's a position where you have to be strong, you have to be capable, and other things, sort of manly kind of traits in some of these things, and Democrats have just disliked it.
Well, again, I think there is a connection between this article and the first one about political fantasies, and I think we can put those two together. As a matter of fact, as it turns out on the page, if you go to pointofview.net, they're right next to each other, so you might see that one relates to the other, and I thought we might bring it full circle. But let's take a break, and when we come back, a very good piece that Dr. Matthews pointed out, and that is Gallup poll has been looking at a number of things. As a matter of fact, I'll also talk about another poll about what is happening with the colleges, but a record high number of Americans say the U.S. government has too much power, and that does not bode well since we're kind of heading towards the midterm elections. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Emily Peck reports that Americans don't think college is worth it. She provides economic facts to show that it still is worth it. She may have trouble convincing many parents and even students. The share of Americans who say college is very important dropped significantly over the past decade. The most significant drop was among Republicans. In 2013, 68% said that a college education was very important. This year it dropped to 20%. Even among Democrats, the percentages dropped by half. You might have predicted some of the drop for Republicans because of the criticism that colleges are indoctrinating students in woke ideas, but the drop among Democrats illustrate that there are other reasons for the declining value of college. Cost is one reason. A college education is very expensive, student debt is high, and graduates wonder if they'll ever make enough money to pay back student loans. In the background is also the fear that AI will shrink the job market for a college graduate. Other opportunities are another reason. There is growing interest on the part of young adults to work in skilled trades. These can be successful careers and would probably be less threatened by AI than white-collar jobs. Emily Peck argues that a college degree is important and points to the fact that college graduates earn twice what high school graduates make. Of course, it is still possible to become financially successful without a college degree, and I suspect that lumped into that median high school degree income are many who never developed meaningful skills and are less employable. Americans are not as convinced as they used to be that college is worth it. Parents and their children need to evaluate what is best for them. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have now a record, and whenever you see that record, it is worth mentioning, and that is more Americans believe that the government has gotten too big than ever before. And so both for Liberty and Merrill, I wanted to, for just a minute, give some history. If you go all the way back to the turn of this century, George W. Bush, about 40% of Americans even then thought the American federal government got too big. But that's 40%. Now it's 62%. What's so interesting is that number began to climb under Bush, especially as you have the war on terror. Then it got pretty significant because, after all, you had this idea originally with Barack Obama to try to have the government we would love, but then you have the Affordable Care Act, which is kind of in the news these days, or Obamacare, and a number of other things, and it went up again, dropped a little bit under Trump and Biden. But here's the interesting thing. The most significant increase came just at the end of the Biden administration and the beginning now of the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. And so it illustrates that it sometimes doesn't necessarily have to do with who the president is. It has to do with the fact that over time, especially under the Biden administration, areas that you would never have thought the government would be intruding into your life actually were beginning to bother individuals. And Dr. Matthews, I'll use you as a great example. We used to have you come on and talk about health care, and I got the sense sometimes the listeners are going to go, I don't know, I'm just not that big a deal. Then we had the Affordable Care Act,
Yes.
and all of a sudden people said, wait a minute, government is actually making decisions that I don't like about the kind of drugs I can use, the kind of doctors I can go to, and that's one of the reasons why that spiked. I think it's spiking again because after Trump has run against the government, even though he'd been president for 4 years, a lot of people said, government is intruding into too many areas in my life.
Right. And it's interesting because in the first graph in this Gallup poll, the one that says the government is doing too little has been running about 6% ever since they've been doing this.
Doesn't matter who it is.
Doesn't matter who it is.
Yeah.
So it's almost a straight line between 2002 and 2025. It's a little more jagged in that its government is too big, 62%. I think as you point out, that's a record, and it's about 30% now think it's about right. But it's interesting because the government is getting involved in so much, and part of the reason why we have a shutdown right now is the Democrats want to keep the government involved in your health care by providing so much more in the way of subsidies and so forth, and Republicans are trying to keep them from doing that. But the government has just gotten involved in almost every aspect of our life these days.
What is so interesting is that, again, when you think about this, you would expect Republicans generally to say government's gotten too big and it's gotten involved in my life. But you're now seeing one of the most precipitous increases is among Democrats because all of a sudden they're saying, wait a minute, Donald Trump is out here and he's actually tearing down the east wing of the White House. We haven't even gotten to that one yet. He's blowing up ships out in the water. ICE is coming and snatching people off the streets. Not that I agree with all the rhetoric around that, but you can start seeing that this is one time when you're almost starting to get bipartisan agreement.
I used to be able to go buy something from Temu and wouldn't have to pay a tariff on there, and now I do have to pay it. So yes, it's involved in all aspects of our lives, and we'll see how this plays out. But one of the things that happens in American political history is once the pendulum swings a little too far, it tends to swing back the other way. And so it'll be interesting because we'll be going to the midterms next year, and the new presidential candidates, some of them are already sort of feeling their way around. We'll see what they want to do, if they want to try to scale back the government or maybe want to make it even bigger.
Liberty, I know you've had some conversations with, of course, the Next Generation Roundtable, and that roundtable kind of changes because with Sohran Mamdani, if indeed he becomes the next mayor of the largest city in the country, some of the love affair that I think the younger generation has with socialism will end pretty quickly, don't you think?
Yeah, well, let's say I hope so. Maybe hardest lessons best learned. But I think, obviously if government's doing something people like, then they are cheering it on. But if government is getting involved in doing things they disagree with, then they say, okay, pump the brakes. But really, I think it's a lesson that hopefully more people carry with them, even though not so sure that'll happen because Americans tend to have a very short memory span. But the more you rely on for government, then when the government shuts down, then the things that you relied on them for, those are taken away. And so even now, I think it's a good example for people who are willing to pay attention that we shouldn't be so dependent on government for everything. And presidents change. So if you like the power that the government has now, because they're doing all the things that you personally are in favor of, well, for 8 more years, that power is still going to be there, but it's going to be somebody you don't like. So something I hope people continue thinking about.
And you raise a good question. I think, wasn't it Mitch Daniels that said, when the government shuts down, you'd be amazed at how much you don't miss it. But that gets us to something which we'll probably talk about more next week, but I thought I'd put it on the table right now. Dr. Matthews, I'll come to you for just a second. We eventually aren't going to have money for SNAP. We're not going to have enough money for food stamps.
Right.
It's bad enough that we're not paying the military. It's bad enough that federal employees are sitting at home and they're not getting paid, or others are working and not getting paid. But when you stop paying individuals, I think Social Security will still come and Medicare will come, but SNAP and food stamps maybe not. That's a quick way to get riots in the streets, don't you think?
And also federal housing. You've got subsidies for federal housings that may not go out there. So, yes, you could end up getting a lot of pushback from them. And, of course, Democrats, one of the things that they do is the Obamacare. They're wanting to keep the subsidies that were passed in the pandemic. And, people just have to understand how much, maybe the term isn't lying, but just misinforms us, because when they passed the Affordable Care Act, this was going to make health insurance affordable. So remember that? It was going to make it affordable.
But it wasn't.
Premiums were going to go
now.
down. And so now the Democrats are saying premiums are so high, we can't let people have to pay those whole premiums. We've got to provide more taxpayer subsidies. Wait a minute. I thought 10 years ago you said premiums were going to go down. It was going to be affordable. Did they call it the Unaffordable Care Act, or did they call it Affordable Care Act?
Yes, and again, we've had those conversations. And Liberty, I used Dr. Matthews as an example because you weren't with us then, but how many times when we would have him come on and talk about health care issues, we'd talk about Hillary Care and things like that, I think some people said, well, it's just hypothetical. But all of a sudden, once the government really did begin to control people's health care, they began to go, wait a minute, I don't feel so good about this. And at a time when you have more individuals in the government suggesting that the solution is more government, I do see these surveys showing that a lot of Americans are saying we have too much government and we need to back off.
Yeah, well, when government gets power, it's very unlikely that they're going to relinquish that power, I think, regardless of what party it is. So once you surrender one area, then I think people need to realize, okay, well, congratulations, now they're in control of that. And yeah, to Dr. Matthews' point, if it's in the name of the legislation or the movement, it's clearly accurate, right?
It's in the name.
Or the Inflation Reduction Act.
Which made inflation worse, yes.
But, you do have to think with this poll that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders have got to be concerned about a poll like this that says people think the government's getting too big because every solution they have is a bigger government.
Bigger government. Just as we go to a break, let me just mention there's another survey that you might want to look at, and it's my commentary today, which we talk about the declining value of college. And if you want to see something drop, look at the fact that not so long ago, Republicans, almost 80%, even just a few years ago, 68% said that college education was important, and that has now dropped to 20%. And even among Democrats, it was up more than 80% and dropped to 42%. So that whole declining value of college is really interesting. And I'll put that up with what we talked about yesterday, because the Manhattan Institute went back and said, let's use some different criteria to evaluate colleges rather than just the acceptance rates and things like that. How dedicated are they to free speech? What are the chances that a graduate would get a job? Number one was University of Florida. As a matter of fact, Florida had 2 colleges, Texas had 2 colleges, Georgia had 2 colleges, Indiana had 2 colleges, and then North Carolina, South Carolina. What's that in common? They're all red states. And they all have governors like a Brian Kemp, or whether it's Ron DeSantis or Greg Abbott, that were actually promoting things. So it's interesting that at a time when many individuals, Americans, think government is too big, a lot of Americans are also saying government isn't as important as it was. And I thought that was just an interesting survey, which we have as one of the commentaries on the website, pointofview.net. Come back. We have a few more things to talk about. We'll do that right after these important messages.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor. And again, if you would like to find some of these articles, I would recommend it. And we're going to convene a history lesson for just a minute. And in some respects, it connects up very much to some of the things we talked about with, of course, the piece by Dr. Matthews on Pete Hegseth and the fact that there have been a number of presidents over the years that have not wanted to have bad information get out about them. This one is a little different, but it illustrates the point. Our friend Cal Thomas, who's been on the program before, said, people who are protesting and complaining that President Trump is behaving like a dictator, and that leads to one we'll have in just a minute with Victor Davis Hanson, and who are the real kings, the No Kings rally, apparently, he says, skipped history classes or took them at liberal universities where professors have rewritten the subject to conform to their worldview. And he points out that Mark Levin, we know Mark Levin, a daily host, as well as an individual has a weekend program on Fox News, goes through some of that. And Dr. Matthews, again, it's about time to get into a history lesson. He mentions John Adams. He talks about Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, U.S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and even John F. Kennedy, just as a few. And anybody that thinks that we have not had individuals that sometimes have had a little bit more authoritarian presidency don't know our history.
Yes, and one of the things that President Trump is trying to, one of the issues he's trying to press is what's called the unitary theory of the presidency, which is the Article 1 of the Constitution gives the president complete control over the executive branch. And, of course, that clearly was true of the initial part of the country, but the executive branch was really fairly small. You had the cabinet, you had a few cabinet members, and you had a few employees, but it was a small branch. It's much bigger now, and we'll see if he's successful with that, but he's intentionally trying to test this theory that the president is limited. He wants to return to the unitary president. We'll see what the Supreme Court decides, because it's got some issues before it which will give us some indication as to what the Supreme Court thinks.
And again, there's some obvious questions of actions that he's taken. You've heard us mention a few. But Liberty, this piece here just reminds us that if you study your history at all, the pushback between the various branches of government, which we sort of anticipated, and even if you read the Federalist Papers, were an attempt to try to have a checks and balances, and even the pushback between the president and some of his rivals is something that we've been seeing for more than 200 years, haven't we?
Yes, and that's why it's so important to teach history well and to study it. And I just think about things that I hear from my generation, millennials and Gen Z, all the time. It's very common meme on social media that says, I'm tired of living in unprecedented times. And it's kind of a joke because, especially COVID and on, we've heard that a lot. But in reality, there's a lot of anxiety tied to it. And I think this is why, at least for younger adults and college age students and everything, you are seeing more and more willingness to go to kind of these extreme ideologies or the violence like we were talking about earlier. There really is this sense that we are treading into, waters that we've never been in before. And that's not to say there aren't unique things about the time that we're living in, but just some perspective, I think, would help people so much. That there's nothing new under the sun. There's hardly anything new under the American sun. And people would maybe calm down a little bit and if they had that perspective, but they're not taught it.
Well, again, I've in the past mentioned in some of the articles I've written about John Adams, second president of the United States, vice president under George Washington, and yet one of the founding fathers. He imprisoned several American citizens under the Alien and Sedition Act, and some of those were journalists. Nothing that Pete Hegseth has called for is anything that extreme. Then this one, of course, reminds us that we have the Insurrection Act that was used by Thomas Thomas Jefferson, the third president, used by Andrew Jackson. Later, it was even used by U.S. Grant. Now, he did that to actually put down the Ku Klux Klan in the South. And then one other one I'll mention before we even get to the 20th century, and that is Abraham Lincoln, of course, did all sorts of things. He confiscated printing materials. He shut down some of the pro-peace newspapers, used, again, some of these acts that were used in the past by Adams and Jackson and others, which, of course, was during a civil war. But anybody that thinks what we are seeing today with the President of the United States, Donald Trump, needs just go back and look at the 19th century alone and see what was actually kind of common fare back then.
And, of course, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus.
There you go.
So that was one of the issues there. And then John Fitzgerald Kennedy put Robert F. Kennedy in as his attorney general. And you would get serious pushback today if a president wanted to put his brother in as attorney general. So, you had to think RFK was going to protect the interests of JFK, and there were some things that were going on that Mark Levin alludes to there. But we've had some times in past which are questionable, and we sometimes forget about those as we move on to the next time, and then we look at the next person, and then we say oftentimes this is different. Donald Trump isn't in a civil war, so maybe it's different in ways that it wasn't for Abraham Lincoln. But those we like, we tend to sort of look over and accept, and those we don't like, we tend to criticize.
Well, and again, let me just give a few from the 20th century, just again for education. Woodrow Wilson, of course, passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and a Sedition Act in 1918, which allowed him to imprison just an enormous number of people. Best estimates are at least 2,000 individuals. And again, some of those were individuals who actually were just on the opposite side politically, including the socialist candidate for the United States. Yeah. Franklin Roosevelt, again, had a war against the press. He had created, of course, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, in 1934, but then reduced the length of the radio license from 3 years to 6 months so that they could abide by the policies of the government.
And you mentioned Woodrow Wilson imprisoning somebody. There's the Japanese internment during World War II.
FDR and all that. And of course, you mentioned Kennedy also appointed a loyalist to the IRS commissioner who would then routinely read the tax filings of the political opponents and then leak those to Ben Bradley, who first of all wrote for the New York Newsweek magazine and now later became the editor of the Washington Post, of course, during the Watergate. Also, Lyndon Johnson used the IRS, the FBI, the CIA, went after his political opponents, spied on Goldwater. All of those kinds of things have been done against Donald Trump, and yet somehow that doesn't seem to show up in the No Kings rally too much.
I will say this, that when those things happened, eventually the American people said, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. Right. So they pushed back against it. So there's a sense in which we'll have to see after Donald Trump leaves office if there'll be pushback on several things. You may see the Supreme Court. I mean, the Supreme Court is going to be listening to his arguments on trade here in the near future. I think there's a good chance the Supreme Court will stop not all of Trump's tariffs. I think there's a good chance it'll do that. So, but the public tends to sort of push back after they see some of these. So, some people have done some things was extending their power, and the public responded in some ways.
Yes. And again, one other one I'll just mention, and we'll certainly cover it after the break, and that is Victor Davis Hanson, who always reminds us. Some of his columns are really good because you'll read through and go, "Oh, I'd forgotten about that." But let me just pick out one before we take a break, and that is he points out the fact that, again, Donald Trump's supposed to be the king, ran in 2 contested primaries, and that's not exactly what Joe Biden did, as we well know, or Kamala Harris, but nevertheless the case. But then points out that then Joe Biden's Department of Justice and the FBI raided Donald Trump's home. They found 102 classified documents among the 14,000 seized, but nevertheless indicted him anyway. And you and I were remembering that weren't there some of these classified documents in a garage over there by a Corvette or something?
Yes, there were. And the way Joe Biden explained it, as I recall, was he had used some of these documents to help him write his memoir, and he left them in there, claimed he didn't know they were classified. They were in by his Corvette. And then they went to Mike Pence and found some as well. So it was something that was going on. Now they found some, I believe, with John Bolton. But at least, I don't think Mike Pence was doing anything wrong. There was nothing there that was suspicious with him. You don't know about Joe Biden, but we found that what one person did wrong, some others may have done as well.
We'll get back in some of the list here on the pardons, and of course a number of other individuals here that maybe now are going to be in some cases indicted or investigated, whether it's Andrew McCabe, James Comey, John Brennan. But I just think these are good articles to sort of remind you that sometimes these issues, again, are perhaps not put in some kind of historical perspective or some kind of logical evaluation. And so that's why we posted some of those for you to read. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we'll also make some comments briefly about Penedexter's commentary, a couple upcoming issues, and of course, next week we'll be covering a lot of these topics we never got around to today. All that coming up right after this.
In an article published in the journal First Things, Jonathan Sanford, president of the University of Dallas, described a concept that rings true for me, having just returned from a 3-week trip to Italy. Dr. Sanford writes, "A pilgrim differs from a tourist in that the former seeks meaning, not diversion. Our students, prepared in advance, arrive at historical and religious sites, ready to see them within a larger story, the unfolding of Western civilization and the Christian tradition. They discover that they themselves belong to this story. Though not anywhere near as well prepared as these students, I hoped my trip to ancient cities and sites where Christianity took root, where it blossomed, and where Christians faced persecution, even death for their faith, would change me. My husband and I took a flight a few days ahead of our tour group to spend time in the churches and art museums of Florence. Once our group arrived, the teaching we received helped us understand Roman society and culture during the time of the imprisonment of the Apostle Paul and through the Renaissance. In churches and museums, our hearts were lifted to worship. We learned that illiterate townspeople could read the story of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ in paintings that adorned the walls of churches. The apostles' stories were similarly chronicled in churches built to honor their lives and deaths. Dr. Sanford, also a philosophy professor, takes students abroad during summer term. In his First Things article, he addresses the superabundance of Western art and architecture and asks, why so many churches adorned with frescoes, mosaics, and sculptures designed to last millennia? Why multi-course Italian meals when one would suffice? These things, he says, are expressions of our deepest longing for the eternal. The structure of ancient cathedrals lifts the eyes, drawing one's attention above. There's a sense of the nearness of Christ. How could I not be changed? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, and let me just mention that Penna Dexter's commentary is posted. I mentioned mine just a minute ago, but again, if you click on it where it says Read Now, there's a place where you can sign up. My commentary appears on your inbox Monday through Friday, hers on Saturday. Liberty, I thought we'd come to you in just a minute because one of the things that I sometimes get somebody saying is, well, where's Penna Dexter? And I've got to text from the other day says, well, I'm in Italy. Okay. And it turns out that she found this very good article in First Things written by Jonathan Sanford, who's the president of the University of Dallas. And Dr. Matthews and I know very well about that institution as well. And she had just returned from a 3-week trip to Italy. And he talks about the fact that a pilgrim differs from a tourist in the former seeks meaning, not diversion. And those of you that have traveled with us or with other churches to go to Israel or to Greece or to Italy or to Egypt, that's been a real benefit. And one of the things Penn is talking about, Liberty, is the value of some of these trips.
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit jealous, and I love her commentary this weekend. And, right now I'm actually working on my master's degree in classical studies, and so I just love this idea of appreciating our tradition and our history. We were talking just a moment ago about learning our history of our nation, but there is so much rich history in the world, within church history and Western civilization. And I think when we allow ourselves to lean into that and study that, we can gain a richer appreciation of the world and of where we are. And just a reminder that, beautiful things are everywhere, and that's still so important today because it points us to our Creator. So great stuff. I recommend people go subscribe to Viewpoints for sure.
And Kerby, some people take trips to have fun. I take trips to learn, and that's exactly what Penn is talking about. And so when we went to Egypt a year and a half or so ago, I spent probably a year before that just reading Egyptian history, because for me, if I already have it sort of sketched out in my mind and I have a framework, then when I'm hearing something from them, I can kind of place it, and I just learn a lot more in that. So what's beneficial now are there are so many trips where you can go and learn about the Reformation, you can go and learn about Egyptian history, Israel history, Middle East, European history, just so many things where you can go and just become acquainted with things and learn from people who are set to give these things in the average person's understanding. They're not speaking in high influential language or so forth, so that people can go and just walk away and feel like I've been there and now I know something about it.
Well, and again, I think we're going to have to figure out a way to get Liberty over to Europe, because that's going to certainly enhance her education there as well. So I just thought it would be interesting for you to see her commentary, Transformative Travel, and it's a very good piece in First Things. Of course, I get First Things on a regular basis, and he is president of the University of Dallas, and that's just another great institution to go to as well. As we're winding down today, let me just also mention that this Who Are the Real Kings is just a reminder of one other polling out of there. The 51 intelligence authorities that said that Hunter Biden's laptop had all the makings of Russian disinformation. If there's any
there was
reason...
disinformation going on, but it wasn't Russian.
That's right. And it gets us back to the Biden Disinformation Governance Board and all that. And some of the worst disinformation has come from the government. But let me give you kind of a preview for next week, because even on Monday, we're going to be talking about a couple of things. One, I've mentioned before, that isn't this interesting that one of the co-founders of Wikipedia actually has said, I launched the site in 2001. Today it's been captured by anonymous editors who manipulated articles to fit their ideological bias. You now have Congress investigating whether there's maybe some foreign entities there. You have 62 accounts with most authority, and only 14% of them reveal a full or real name. So that's something we'll be talking about. We'll also be talking about the issue of education, because Hutz Hertzberg is an individual with Turning Point. I remember calling him and talking to him before he went to work with them, and he was quoted recently in this very important article that appeared in Breakpoint Commentary. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Dr. Merrill Matthews, sports gambling's in the news. We haven't mentioned it today, but I think we will get into it in a very significant way on Monday.
And that's an important question, because if you're a Christian, at least I do, I tend to have an aversion to gambling. I don't.
Me too.
If I end up in Las Vegas, I don't necessarily want to go, but I don't go and bet money. That's me. But there are so many ways now that people can begin to bet, and some people would argue that just even buying in the stock market is a type of gambling. So it'll be very interesting to see where you go with that, because is it the same thing as if I say I'm going to bet on the Dallas Cowboys versus the Redskins, as it is if I'm going and sitting at a table and playing blackjack? And I don't know the answer to that.
And again, I wrote a book years ago called Christian Ethics in Plain Language, and there's a chapter in there on gambling. And some of the stuff on sports gambling came from, and this dates me, remember McNeil Lair report on PBS? Well, I think at that time when I did it, it was just Jim Lair report. Mm-hmm. And I was supposed to debate Jimmy the Greek, if you remember him. Mm-hmm. And at the last moment, he just sent one of his associates. But we went back and forth, and part of the issue that I pointed out with sports gambling is you don't just bet on the winner, you bet on the if you will, the actual amount of winning. And so in some respects, you can see, and this is where the scandal has surfaced now with NBA, well, if I know that I'm going to come down with an, quote, injury, and thus it's going to help you deal with the spread more effectively, or in some cases, they were actually involved in all sorts of illegitimate poker playing. This has got to be a scandal that I think before we're all through, we're going to have some pretty notable athletes in the midst of it.
It may very well be. And of course, just mentioning how this plays in, when people used to go to the office, they oftentimes had a pool where you're going to bet on various games. Is that gambling? Is that appropriate for Christians? And if I can do it at the office, can I do it online?
Well, I'll have some fun with that on Monday, and I'm sure we'll get some phone calls. But no, there's no scripture passage that says thou shalt not gamble. But there are some passages about covetousness and envy and a variety of other things, and certainly betting money that is not discretionary income, all sorts of things. So we'll get into that because it's in the news once again. And I think, as we have said so often, Liberty, everything's on the table, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Everything affecting your life. And with this gambling issue, there's a lot of young men, especially with the online nature of it now, where it's really becoming an addiction. So it's relevant to talk about.
And the sports gambling apparently is involved in the mob. So if you've got organized crime in there, does that play a role?
So anyway, I've just given you a preview. And that's just Monday, by the way. And then we will certainly be covering all sorts of very important topics all week. But first of all, let me encourage you to find some of these articles. Of course, the one by Dr. Merrill Matthews, you can find it at The Hill. Also, the one Why Men Are Leaving the Left is also in The Hill. And then some of these others from Gallup and Town Hall and a variety of others, even one from Politico. So lots of great material that we have been trying to cover today just to educate you a little bit more about some of these important issues. And I certainly would encourage you to take the time to join us next week. We're going to be certainly talking with O.S. Hawkins and Jason Riley about his book and some others. So it's just a lot of really good material coming up here. But Liberty also might just mention that we do have a link to the Know Why podcast, and I would encourage people to be listening to that. We have a chance for you to, of course, get the Pray for America material that you put together, and of course, we have an opportunity for you to even send to people maybe the highlights of Point of View, which is on Spotify, and of course, many of those can be found on Apple as well. As we wind down for today, let me encourage you to have a great weekend. And first of all, I want to thank Megan for their help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.